Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here. My name is Mac Barrett. I'm the curator of public programming here. It's my pleasure on behalf of Harold Holzer, director of Roosevelt House, and President Raab of Hunter College, to welcome you all here tonight for what promises to be an excellent program. That doesn't usually happen. Okay. I'd like to introduce our two guests this evening. Tonight we welcome Henry Hemming, author of 6 books, including Agent M, The Lives and Spies of M15's Maxwell Knight, the New York Times bestseller, The Ingenious Mr. Pike, Inventor, Fugitive Spy, and his new book, Agents of Influence, A British Campaign, A Canadian Spy, and the Secret Plot to Bring America into World War II. He'll be speaking about that book with Benjamin Hett, a professor of history here at Hunter College and at the CUNY Graduate Center. Benjamin Hett's most recent book is Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic. Please be sure to turn off your ringing and buzzing devices of all kinds. We don't ordinarily make it through a program without something going off, so it's something to aspire to. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Henry Hemming and Benjamin Hett.
Okay, thank you very much, Mac, and welcome everybody. And Henry, I'd like to welcome you to Hunter College and to Roosevelt House. It's really wonderful to have you here and to talk about this fascinating book. So on that, let's start with one part of the subtitle, The Canadian Spy. Since I grew up in Western Canada, not incredibly far from the protagonist of this story, I think we'll start with that. So this book centers around this fascinating man named William Stevenson. So why don't you start off by telling us a bit about William Stevenson?
Sure. So, and thank you for the lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here. I'm interested, has anybody here, just quick show of hands, has anybody here heard of Sir William Stevenson? This is good, okay. So, as you may or may not know, William Stevenson grew up in Winnipeg in Canada. I mean, he's in this book as a senior MI6 officer, which, I mean, immediately on hearing that, you're probably thinking privately educated, someone with family connections to espionage and the intelligence community. And William Stevenson is in so many ways the opposite. He grew up in the red light district of Winnipeg in Canada. He was orphaned by the age of 5. His father had died. His mother actually then moved away from Winnipeg, put him up for adoption, moved away with his 2 siblings. He then proves himself to be remarkably brave. He becomes a flying ace during the First World War. Then he moves to London and he reinvents himself. He no longer talks about his past when he absolutely clams up if anyone asks him about his childhood. And he becomes a tech entrepreneur, as we would call it. He makes a fortune in radio, and by the 1930s, he is a successful businessman. But he's someone who, as I argue in the book, is after something else. Money alone is not satisfying him. He has, by the way, at this time, so that he has an edge on some of his business rivals, an informal network of people who provide information about what's going on in countries where he has some kind of investment. And some of these countries include Germany and Sweden. And as well as getting business intelligence, he begins to get political intelligence. And then he gives this agent network a name. He calls it the British Industrial Secret Service, which is quite a provocative title, given that there was an actual British Secret Service. And I think he wanted to come to the attention of MI6, and this is what happens. And eventually, he gets taken on by MI6, and eventually he's sent to New York and given this extraordinary new mission.
Okay, and so let's take it up right there. I think maybe if you could start by sort of setting the context for us. It's New York. We're in the years 1940 and 1941. These are incredibly dramatic and pivotal times in American and in world history. So can you tell us a little bit about the context he's moving into, how World War II is going, what's happening in the United States, what the British are worried about, and what his mission is?
Sure. So I mean, the book begins with him getting on a boat, or rather a ship from London all the way, so Liverpool all the way over to New York. And this is June 1940. And Britain is on the ropes. The evacuation from Dunkirk has just finished. And the country that Stevenson is going to, the US at this point, is by and large isolationist in outlook. A Gallup poll completed in I think early June shows that 7% of those surveyed think that America must come into the war at that time. I mean, that's amazing. 93% of Americans either had no opinion or felt it was a huge mistake and the country should not come in. So that's, I suppose, a backdrop to it. It's maybe worth talking a little bit more about why. Where does this isolationist sentiment come from? And there are a variety of things that drive it. I mean, one is many isolationists would talk about the founding fathers and their insistence on avoiding entangling foreign alliances. So that's part of it. And another part of it is political and military, in the sense that most isolationists would argue that Hitler doesn't actually have a plan to invade America, and that even if he did, it's not going to work. And as some of them pointed out, he's tried to invade Britain. He'd love to invade Britain, but he can't even get over the English Channel. So how's he going to get across the Atlantic Ocean? And that's a perfectly sound, sensible argument. Most historians of the subject since would agree that at the time it was not a practical proposition. But there's something else to this. I mean, in terms of what it means to be American and what America's place in the world should be, there's also, I mean, the one other thing I want to add is just the memory of America coming into the First World War. And by the 1930s, there is a strong sentiment in many parts of America whereby America had been tricked, effectively, into coming into the First World War. This has become a popular notion. There was even a Senate committee investigation into it in the 30s. And the idea was that a cabal of arms dealers, aided by the British, maybe directed by the British, had somehow tricked the country using propaganda and the press. And mindful of this, believing in this, a lot of isolationists felt, we don't want that to happen again.
And so, and by the way, any overtones you're hearing that resonate with current events is entirely not the responsibility of Henry or myself. But since we've been talking a little bit about American isolationism, let's talk about a specific manifestation of that, America First. You write quite a bit about Charles Lindbergh, the most prominent spokesman for America First. Can you talk a little bit about what the nature of his campaign was?
Yeah, sure. This is, and I think whenever you're thinking about writing a book and you're sort of trying to survey the landscape of this particular work, it was the moment when I realized that Charles Lindbergh's story, if you like, during these 18 months leading up to Pearl Harbor, that's really when I knew this was a book I wanted to do. Charles Lindbergh, I mean, he comes back to America in April 1939. He's been living in Europe, and he's visited Germany quite a few times. And he's pretty open in his diary about the fact that he admires the Nazi regime. He admires what he's seen. Of course, he hasn't seen everything. He's shown a sanitized version of it. But he still likes what he has seen. He comes back to America in April 1939 to campaign. Really, it's not a case of not helping Britain. His campaign is centered on one thing: America must not go to war against Germany. That is what's driving him on initially. And when he begins to give these speeches, everyone is amazed, because this is the guy who is famous mainly for having flown across the Atlantic single-handedly, and he really has not made any political utterances until then. I mean, I'm trying to think of a modern-day parallel. It's a bit like, I don't know, sort of well-known, lovable, sort of Brad Pitt suddenly saying, I'm going to take a sort of slightly controversial political stance and tour the country giving speeches about this slightly controversial political idea. Anyway, this is what he does. And as he goes on, different elements come out, a different angle comes out. He begins to realize there's more that he can do. A lot of this, I suppose, is to do with America being slightly different to how he remembered it, and he felt there were more problems going on in America, and a lot of these have to do with race and to do with his idea of what American meant.
You talk in particular about the infamous speech he gives in Des Moines, Iowa, in I think it's late summer, early fall of 1941. where the anti-Semitic drift of what he's saying really comes out, and he's arguing that there is a kind of Jewish conspiracy, if you will, trying to pull the United States into the war. Now, what I found really powerful and bleakly funny about your account is that, of course, he's quite wrong about that, but he's not wrong that there is a conspiracy to pull Britain into the war. It's just that it's a British conspiracy. And ironically, given you mentioned the Nye Committee of the 1930s that had really retailed the idea that a British conspiracy had pulled America into the First World War, and now it's actually coming true. And this brings us back to William Stephenson. So a lot of what William Stephenson got up to in New York is really remarkable in terms of the scale of deception, really, that our cousins across the pond were pulling over here. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about some of these operations that Bill Stephenson was kind of overseeing.
Yes, and as a cousin from across the pond, I feel feel sheepish. But anyway,
It's all for a good cause.
it's so. I mean, if we fast forward a year from the moment Bill Stephenson arrives, so now in the summer of 1941, just to give you a sense of the kind of as you say, the scale of the operation. By this point, he has a number of agents inside American pressure groups calling for America to come into the war. He has agents inside polling organizations, including the Gallup polling organization. He has also cultivated a particular American, Wild Bill Donovan, and maneuvered him into position as the director of the new, well, it's the first centralized intelligence agency in American history. It later becomes the CIA. At the time, it's called the COI. And this, by the way, gives him an enormous opportunity, which he takes, to present pro-British intelligence, which Donovan then passes on to Roosevelt and to other customers in the US government, saying, oh, by the way, this is my stuff. This hasn't come from MI6 at all. And so for the first 4 months of this agency's existence, it is passing off, as I say, fairly tendentious pro-British stuff, intelligence that suggests that Britain's doing a little bit better than it actually is in the war. And I think this helps play a part in shifting opinions in Washington at that time. But Stephenson also has this extraordinary office in the Rockefeller Center in New York. And at the heart of it is essentially a fake news operation. It's and amazingly, it was called fake news at the time as well. I mean, it's the pre-internet equivalent of a troll farm he's got. And at its peak, it's putting out between 20 to 25 fake stories into the American media cycle every week. And I could give you a little taste of that. I could talk about one fake news story just to kind of flesh this out. There's a village in France called Berck-sur-Mer, which it was reported in the New York Post, the Baltimore Sun, and the Herald Tribune that on the 17th of June, 1941, a team of British parachutists landed just outside this village, and they managed to overwhelm the guards at a Nazi airfield. They blew up 30 German planes. They captured 30 German pilots. The French villagers who saw this were so inspired that they volunteered on the spot to fight with the British. And then the British, plus the French volunteers, plus the captured German pilots, all managed to get to a series of waiting boats that were parked on the beach. And then they got all the way back across the English Channel. There were no casualties. The alarm was not raised until they were back celebrating at home. It was an extraordinary, courageous, unheard of raid, and of course it never took place. It was actually based on rumor number 287, which originated in London. There was a group called the SIB Committee. It sounds like I'm making this up. This is real. The SIB Committee would meet once a week in Whitehall, and it was a team of civil servants who would come up with weird and wonderful rumors to spread around the world, all of which they hoped would help the British war effort and serve strategic interests in some way. They sent the skeleton of this raid, imaginary raid, over to New York, and then people like Bill Stephenson and those working for him, this extraordinary ragtag of people, including Roald Dahl, including David Ogilvy, later known as the father of advertising, and even at that point, including a guy called Ian Fleming. So that's how this story came about. That was just one of the fake stories they got. But the next question is, how did they actually get it into the press? How did all these respectable papers take it on? And I'll tell you about just two things they did to make this particular story become real. They sent a version of it to something called the ONA. This is the Overseas News Agency. And about 2 months previously, Stevenson had come to a secret agreement with the head of the ONA, whereby in return for a fairly large sum of money paid monthly, the ONA would broadcast fake British stories, but not within the US. This is a key detail. Instead, they broadcast them over to Europe, where they were picked up in occupied Europe, but also in neutral capital cities like Zurich and Stockholm. At the same time, Stevenson's office sends a slightly different version of this story over to something called WRUL, which actually I think is still going. It was a very powerful shortwave radio station based in Boston. Again, Stevenson has a secret agreement with the guy running this. And again, they don't broadcast this within the US. They send it over to Europe. So then it's picked up in Europe, and then it's sent back to America. And there, the news editors of the New York Post and so on pick it up, it seems real, and they run it.
One of the things I loved about all of this is that there's a certain amount of kind of intelligence jargon or terminology, call it what you will, that goes with these operations, which reminded me a little bit of the incredible vocabulary that John le Carré worked out for intelligence operations, which then kind of permeated into real intelligence operations. So you used the term SIB. I think it would be great if you could just explain where that came from. And then my actual favorite was paperclip. Can you explain what a paperclip is?
Yeah, sure. So SIB comes from the Latin sibillare, meaning to whisper, and hence the kind of the whispering committee. And the SIB committee, each of these little rumors, so that story I told you about Berks-sur-Mer, that was called a SIB. And this, this office was in the business of getting SIBs out there. Now, a paperclip is when you have material that's come from a secret source. So one good example is some photographs of genuine executions taking place in occupied Europe, but they were brought out via a secret source. And in order to not compromise that secret source, a paperclip was attached. And what they meant by that was just a fake story to explain where these photographs had come from. And I think in this case, the fake story was, it sounds sort of so improbable, you can't imagine anyone believing it. The fake story was that a Luftwaffe pilot had been so fond of these pictures, these grisly photographs of people being executed, that he kept it in his jacket pocket at all times. And the British were doing so well in shooting down Luftwaffe pilots that in one of the many German planes shot down over British territory, this photograph was found on the Luftwaffe pilot. So it was a paperclip that, again, served the same basic purpose of showing the idea that the British are doing better.
And another highly skillful kind of operation that they carried out involved the forging of documents. And you have some examples of the really remarkable lengths that Stevenson's operation would go to produce incredibly careful forged documents to achieve some of these same purposes. Can you tell us a little bit about one of those?
Yeah, sure. There's, I guess one of the one I enjoyed writing about the most in the book is the South American map, and this is it's fairly well known. It was described by Roosevelt. I'm glad we're sitting in his house talking about this. He described it in a speech on the 27th of October, 1941, and this was broadcast live to the country, and of course the text of the speech was soon relayed around the world. And in this speech, he described having been given a South American map showing what South America would look like after a successful German invasion. And this, as he said in the speech, was proof of German plans to invade South America. And this also posed a threat to the United States itself. And this is very much part of Roosevelt saying, we need to come into the war. Here's the proof. This map was a forgery. This map had, in fact, been made in something called Station M, which it was called M after the person who ran it, a guy called Eric Maschwitz, the Oscar-nominated screenwriter and lyricist, the man who actually wrote A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square. So he was also a brilliant forger. And this was based in Canada. And he had a team working for him. And yeah, as Ben was saying, the lengths they went to were extraordinary. They made sure the paper that this map was on was absolutely right. They had samples of the kinds of paper that would be used by a German government official making a map of this type. So they tried to replicate that, working with Canadian paper manufacturers. They also made sure the ink was absolutely right and could be traced if it was ever examined. They also made sure the handwriting, this is crucial because on this map, the guy who made it took the pretty bold decision to add a few kind of scribbles in the margin. So he impersonates a German civil servant, saying essentially, you've got this map wrong again, you need to change this, this, and do this better next time. Which, of course, adds verisimilitude, but also is a risk. If you get that kind of thing wrong, if the handwriting doesn't look German, then you have a problem. So they went to great lengths, and on this occasion, it was not revealed to be a fake until, I think, 1970s.
You know, as someone who has studied the Nazis and Nazi dishonesty quite a bit, when I read that, I enjoyed imagining Hitler and Joseph Goebbels, these masters of lies, now confronting this massive lie about what they were doing, and they, after knowing that they had lied for years to get where they were going, they must have thought, "Oh my God, like this is not true." It must have driven them crazy.
I mean, it really did. It's just worth adding. The first speech Hitler gives after that Roosevelt speech is about 8 days later. And apparently he could talk of nothing but the South American map. He was, furious.
His theory of the big lie proven quite definitively. So since we're in FDR's house, let's talk a little bit about FDR, because I was struck in some ways by the portrayal of FDR that emerges from your book. He's one of the more, I think, difficult and fascinating people to study because he was so ambiguous and never let a lot out, or he let lots out and you never know which is quite authentic. He was always compared with reason to a sphinx. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Roosevelt sort of received some of this information and what effect it had on his policies.
Sure. So, I mean, I could start maybe with the map because that's sort of fresh in everyone's mind. What's interesting about this map is, I mean, Roosevelt presents it to the country, to the world, and the obvious question is, did he know? Did he understand that this was a forgery? And I think this tells us a lot about where he was in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of how far he was willing to go and the risks he was willing to take. There's an amazing document which I read during the course of the research for Agents of Influence, which describes a meeting with Roosevelt and a guy called Adolf Burley, someone who's known Roosevelt for a long time. He's a senior government official. And Burley goes in to see Roosevelt in September 41, so just a few weeks before this map moment. And he brings with him a dossier. And in this dossier, Burley has proof of 3 separate occasions in which MI6 has been trying to fabricate evidence of a German plot in South America. And Burley presents this to Roosevelt. He talks him through the different fabrications, and Burley's furious. He's someone who's an interesting character in his own right. He has a deep dislike of the British and spies and the idea of a foreign nation propagating propaganda in America. I mean, he does not like the idea of Stevenson and what he's doing at all. So he's angry about this. And his account of the meeting is interesting because he says Roosevelt was cautious and curiously reserved. And then at the end of it says he might get someone to look into it. And then a few weeks later, he's presented by his head of intelligence, Wild Bill Donovan, with this South American map. And he knows that Donovan is close to MI6. I think it would have been very, very strange if Roosevelt had not at least suspected that this map had in fact come from MI6. And I guess in between sort of knowing something to be fake and knowing it to be real, there is this gray area in between where you don't ask the question. You may suspect something to yourself, but by not asking the question, you're almost complicit in the act. Well, this is what happens. We don't have Roosevelt writing down and saying, I know this map was a fake. But we also know that in the speech, he says, I presented this map to you, the American people. It will be denounced by Berlin as a fake. And that's not the kind of thing you say in a speech when you know you have something utterly, utterly authentic. And something about the way when he's asked in the press conference the next day, is it possible that this is a fake? The way he bristles in response, I think, is suggestive. And the reason I'm saying all this is that I would argue by this point in his presidency, not only has he come out as an interventionist, he's also decided that there are few things he won't do in order to engineer an incident, in order to provoke Germany into declaring war on America.
And I thought that was one of the things that was precisely really interesting about your book, because the angle that you're coming from, looking at these British operations and the effect they have, that angle I think gives us quite a different FDR, because I think if you boil down the literature on FDR to something like a consensus, it's sort of that he won't ever take a risk. And he's really hesitant about moving towards war. He really sort of passively aggressively wants public opinion to get there first before he does anything at all. And he eventually has to get dragged in kicking and screaming by the attack on Pearl Harbor. But your FDR is much more of a risk taker, and is actually, especially in the second half of 1941, really quite aggressively moving towards getting the United States into the war. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, like this series of things that come up from about July 41 on towards Pearl Harbor, and how we see FDR moving towards war.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I could talk about some of the other things that he does to try and provoke war. He signs off on, and again, these are all things I found from recently released material in British archives, which, as far as I'm aware, are not documented in American archives. He signs off on this curious thing. He wants leaflets to be dropped over Nazi-occupied Europe, saying Roosevelt and Churchill are on the same side in terms of what they believe, but also with this curious line that he wants to have even translated into French at the bottom, saying, produced by the American government and dropped by our friends in the RAF. And he wants this, he doesn't want everyone in America to know about this, but he wants the Germans to know that he is as close to being an ally to Britain as possible. There's another moment where he needs to get the religious leaders, some of the leading church figures in America, on side with the idea of supporting Moscow and sending more aid via Lend-Lease. And the problem is that for the last few years, he and the church leaders have been saying quite rightly that Russia's attitude towards organized religion is abominable, and there's good evidence of it. But Roosevelt realizes he needs to present a different picture. So he turns to Wild Bill Donovan and says, I need you to get a story into the press saying that Russia actually has a great attitude towards religion. And then I will just comment on it and say, I've read that Russia has a great attitude towards religion. Wild Bill Donovan has no idea how to do this, so he turns to Bill Stevenson of MI6. Bill Stevenson of MI6 then gets in touch with London, and soon the Polish government in exile gives this extraordinary press conference. And you can almost sort of hear the strain in their, well, you imagine the strain in their voices as they say they're pleasantly surprised by how tolerant the Russian regime has been since occupying their country. And so this becomes a story, and then sure enough, the day after this, Roosevelt comments on it, and he gets the headlines that he wants. And this, to me, reading about this is only in recently declassified material in a British archive, was fascinating. I mean, this is very topical. Press manipulation, it's, is it an abuse of office? I don't know. If you were looking for grounds for impeachment at the time, that might help you out.
Which FDR was really conscious of. I mean, half the time that he ever had conversations with the British ambassador, he would say, by the way, don't tell anybody this or I'll get impeached. So that was not ever far from his own mind. Now, of course, the Germans aren't the only problem that either the British or the Americans are worrying about. There's also Japan. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this sort of tri-corner connections work out between Britain and the United States and Japan, especially in 1941.
Sure. There's, interestingly, the Stevenson campaign, the British, they weren't thinking about Japan almost at all. Their policy in terms of the influence campaign towards Japan was that it wasn't going to happen. And so all of their focus was on Germany. It's relevant to this book in the sense that there's a crucial moment where intelligence provided by Wild Bill Donovan, and actually this is not from Stevenson, this is genuine intelligence that Donovan gets, leads him to believe that if America goes to war with Japan, Germany will come in automatically. Now, there's no treaty which says this to be the case, but soon after Roosevelt is told this is in November 1941, you could say his attitudes towards the Japanese negotiations change. He becomes more belligerent, he becomes more demanding. And at this time, as we all know, he's aware that there are two factions in Tokyo, one that desperately wants to go to war, one which does not. He's also aware that there is a deadline that's been set in Tokyo, which is, I think, either the 25th or 26th of November. And he knows that if the peace, the Dove faction, does not get some kind of response or something to take back to Tokyo, then plans will get going for war. He knows this, and yet he fails to give the Japanese negotiators who are looking for something to take back, fails to give them anything. And in doing that, as the great Dorothy Thompson later wrote, he allowed America to go to war with Japan. He knew, therefore, a Japanese attack would come. But in terms of the British involvement in this, there's almost none.
You mentioned factions in Japan. Of course, there are factions in the American government as well, and you talked about Burley. Donovan was sort of Burley's bête noire, I think. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of tension between those guys?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, Donovan is, again, maybe it's worth touching just on him as a character. He's an extraordinary man. He is, in some ways, the sort of embodiment of the American dream. He grows up in upstate New York, in a tough neighborhood, Irish-American background. He, during the First World War, he becomes one of the most decorated soldiers in American military history. And he's someone who does not feel fear, as far as we can tell. And he then makes a fortune as a lawyer. He has his own practice. He's a millionaire. And at the same time, he's desperate to get into politics. And for almost 18 years during the 20s and 30s, he keeps trying to get a job or get elected, and he keeps failing. And there's this, so he's attracted to Roosevelt because Roosevelt can offer him or could allow him some of the political power that he is after. And he's prepared to do almost whatever it takes to get there. Roosevelt finally offers him this job of running a centralized intelligence agency called the COI. But meanwhile, Adolf Burley is deeply suspicious of how close Donovan is to the British. And Burley never really finds out the extent of it. And I mean, in this day and age, it feels amazing, but it takes him and the State Department almost 5 weeks to actually locate where Bill Stevenson lives in New York. And then they can't find his office. It takes them another few weeks to find that. But Burley is slowly, during the course of this book, slowly homing in on Stevenson and his office and what they're up to. And the truth, I mean, the reality, and it's maybe something I should have brought up or kind of introduced earlier, it's described as a British influence campaign, and yet, really, it's an Anglo-American campaign. I mean, it could not have prospered in the way that it did without the support or the willingness of high-profile Americans to turn a blind eye. They needed the support of not only influential East Coasters, but also the tacit support of the White House.
Right. Could you say a little more about that, actually? As we talked about Lindbergh, can you talk a little bit about who's on the other side in the United States, those influential East Coasters who are facilitating this relationship?
The best way into it is this group called the Century Group. And because one of their first meetings was at the Century Association, not too far from where we are right now. And the Century Group was an informal association of about, say, 22 people, I think, who all wanted America to come into the war. But these were 22 of the most powerful people you could think of. They were in media, they were were they politicians? They had an enormous range of connections, and they're also very wealthy. And they begin to do everything they can. They start to campaign. They start to try to change American public opinion. And early on, they're working with some of the people associated with Stevenson's campaign. So they're working with the British ambassador, Lord Lothian, and then Bill Stevenson gets in touch with Donovan. Donovan is also loosely affiliated to this group. So you have this association of people who are both British and American. And it's fascinating seeing just how much they have in common. They all are familiar with New York as much as London. They're all reading the same magazines and newspapers. They've all got friends in common. They have a huge amount that binds them. And they all fiercely believe that the most important thing in the world to do right then was to take on Hitler. And that shared belief blinds them in some respects to occasionally the legality of what they're doing, but also you could say the ethics.
It's such an interesting issue because I think no one could read your book now in 2019 and not hear some of these overtones of foreign influence and fake news and so on. And yet, no one, I devoutly hope, would read this book thinking it was for a bad cause. I mean, at the end of the day, thank goodness the United States got into the war and Germany was defeated. But I wonder if you could comment, since I'm sure it's going to be on a lot of people's minds. For you, do you see that there are lessons here? Do you see that the story you're telling, does it put contemporary events in a different perspective in any way? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, contemporary events are what brought me into this story. The seed was sown, really, watching the news, hearing the news, reading about the news in 2016, reading about the, I have to say, alleged Russian influence campaign in the months before Trump's election. And that got me thinking about other influence campaigns, specifically in America. And this British influence campaign was larger in terms of the number of people it had working for it. And was it more effective? This is an interesting question. What was the precise impact of this British campaign? And also what was the precise impact of the Russian campaign? But in terms of what can we learn from it, most of what we know about latter-day influence campaigns comes from whistleblower accounts. There are several accounts from people who worked at Cambridge Analytica, which are beginning to shed some light on how these operations work. And at the same time, there's no contemporary account of exactly what it is to set one of these up and to set the strategy. And the whistleblower accounts provide some perspective on this, but they don't give the whole picture. And what I found fascinating reading more about this is just the similarity in methodology. Obviously, the technology changes between the 1940s and the modern day. But as I say, the methodology is not completely different. And you're left with this slightly strange, slippery idea that, as you said, fake news can perhaps be put to a good use on occasion, maybe as it was in the early 1940s, but then on other occasions not. So we're left in a place where should we understand this in order to use it, or should we understand it simply to protect ourselves from it? I would argue the more we know about this, the better. The more we understand how these operations work, the more inoculated we are against them. And if you want to boil it all down to one really simple, basic motif, it's the same thing I remember being taught in my first history lesson, which is always question your sources.
Oh, amen to that. It seems to me, from the picture you draw in your book, that the British campaign in 1940 and 41 was massively effective. I mean, I think the picture you paint of the really significant swing in American public opinion about the war in that era, my understanding, at least, of your argument is that you say the British have a very big part in that. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. And there is, I mean, just to sketch out just how big a swing that was, I mentioned at the start of this event that a Gallup poll showed 7% of the American people wanted to come into the war in June 1940. And when a slightly different question is asked in November 41 and others in October 41, you have, I think it's 75% or 80% of the people questioned saying Nazi Germany must be defeated at some point, or saying I approve of Roosevelt's fairly aggressive foreign policy and attitude towards Germany. And this is a huge, huge shift. I mean, America on the eve of Pearl Harbor, and this is something which often gets lost in the sort of simplified narrative. America on the eve of Pearl Harbor was a nation ready to go to war in terms of how public opinion had shifted. And I mean, the next sort of question this brings up is, kind of, so what? Surely Pearl Harbor did it. And there are two things to say. Yes, Pearl Harbor obviously brings America into a war against Japan. But Hitler doesn't need to declare war on America. And all of his military advisors are saying, this is a bad idea, all with only a few exceptions. And he's always said up until then that taking on America will only happen once he's defeated Russia. But he changes his mind, and he declares war on the 11th of December, despite having no obligation to do so. It's been described as one of the great mistakes of the Second World War, an unforced error. But I would argue that seeing what Roosevelt was doing from Hitler's perspective forced his hand. And him knowing that Roosevelt was, as far as Hitler was concerned, willing to lie to his people on a brazen scale by producing these forgeries. Him seeing that, I think, forced him into, or not forced is too strong, provoked him into this mistake. And there's just one other thing to say in terms of just the effect of this shift in public opinion. There's a little remembered moment in January 1942 when Roosevelt fairly calmly announces that the United States Armed Forces will not be going after Japan first, they'll be going after Germany first, and then Japan second. And on the face of it, that makes no sense. I mean, Pearl Harbor is just as absolutely fresh in the national memory, and yet he's able to say, we're going to go after Germany first. And even in the days after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt is promoting the line that Germany is in fact behind this attack. The shift in public opinion allows him to do that, and that, of course, changes completely the complexion of the Second World War.
It's such a delicious irony that something that drove Hitler into declaring war on the United States was that he was shocked that FDR would lie to his people. I'm going to savor that a little bit. I want to talk about a couple of sort of points of coda, I think, to the story. So one involves what happened, especially to Bill Stevenson after the war. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Bill Stevenson is increasingly, as the war goes on, he's still based in New York. Increasingly, he's a man out of step, in the sense that he was at his best, at his maverick best, running this fairly freewheeling influence campaign, breaking quite a few laws along the way. The moment America comes into the war, things change. No longer will the same officials who once turned a blind eye to what he was doing turn a blind eye. So he becomes increasingly unpopular within East Coast and official circles. And then at the end of the war, he's dropped by MI6, essentially. He's given a knighthood. He becomes Sir William Stevenson, and he retires. And like everyone who's worked for MI6 at that time, he takes a vow of silence. It's not just the Official Secrets Act. It's a more cultural thing as well. If you work for MI6, you don't talk about what you've done. This is something he's become familiar with. And then about 6 years later, his resolve breaks, and he gives one interview. He gives one interview to a magazine, and this weird, colorful piece appears in Maclean's, giving this sort of strange, slightly jagged account of what happened. And then he suddenly realizes what he's done, and he goes quiet, and he refuses to have any reprints of this article. And for 10 years, there's nothing more. But then the same impulse seems to come back. And he then asks for an official biography of himself to be written. And I think by this point, he's beginning to worry that his role, or what he did, will just be forgotten. But there's something else. He's had 2 strokes by this point. One person described this tendency he had to tell other people's stories, but inserting himself as the protagonist of someone else's story. His mind is beginning to play tricks on him. And then in the 1970s, a charming Canadian writer called William Stevenson, with a V, very confusing, befriends him and says, I want to write your story. And he writes a book which is called A Man Called Intrepid. It sells more than 2 million copies. And I remember meeting someone who later talked to Stevenson with a V. And he said to Stevenson with a V, I've read this book, and it seems that you've made quite a lot of it up. Why did you do this? And Stevenson with a V does not deny it. Instead, he says, if I'd known how many copies it was going to sell, I'd never have done that.
And just finally, and I think this will be intriguing for people, you have a personal connection to this story. Can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I do. I would not be here were it not for Bill Stevenson. He saved my dad's life. He saved my dad's life long before I was born, on a sunny day in 1938 when Dad was about 3. My Canadian grandparents had got to know Stevenson. They were all living in London. And I hope you don't mind, I'm going to save the story for the book. But there was a life-saving incident which involves Bill Stevenson and my accident-prone 3-year-old dad. And without that, I would not be here.
So that's a bit of a cliffhanger. You can buy the book and find out what happened, and it will, of course, be on sale later on. So I think with that, we'll turn it open to questions. So I think the they'll be coming around with the mic. So yes, sir, in the red sweater there.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. Is it true that Stevenson and actually MI6 helped set up the OSS, which becomes a forerunner of the COA and then the CIA, and obviously made the inroads right there to use them as a conduit for their campaign?
Thank you. Broadly speaking, yes. We know that the idea begins with Bill Stevenson, and I love telling this in New York. It was over martinis at the 21 Club, so not too far from where we are now. And actually, this is even better. I've seen pictures of the 21 Club, and they had circular small tables with white tablecloths. So you can almost imagine, I'll be Bill Stevenson, you be Bill Donovan. He was talking to Bill Donovan, and he talks Bill Donovan into the idea of not only helping to set up this new intelligence agency, but he persuades Donovan that he is the one who should be running it. And to begin with, Donovan wants nothing to do with this. He says, look, I want to be a politician, I want to be a soldier, I don't want to be a spy. That was never part of my list of ambitions. But after many martinis and many drinks around a table just like this, Donovan comes round to the idea. And then in sort of April, May 1941, there's this behind-the-scenes campaign to convince Roosevelt that he needs to not only create this new agency, and by the way, there's huge opposition to this from the existing intelligence agencies, but also to put Bill Donovan in charge. And yeah, that's Stevenson is doing everything he can. I think it's maybe too much to say that Stevenson was single-handedly behind it, but he was doing absolutely everything he could. I mean, it was Roosevelt who ultimately signs off on it and who actually brings it into being. And of course, it's Donovan also who joins the campaign and agrees to run this. So it's a team effort.
I was intrigued. I didn't know this. I learned from your book that there's actually a statue of Stevenson in the main entry hall of the CIA headquarters in Langley, which that says a lot.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely, we can call him the godfather of the CIA.
Okay, further. Yes, sir.
Henry, your book is extremely clear, I think, and well written as well. And you mentioned declassified material that's recently become available. And I wonder if you'd comment a little bit on what's known now that wasn't known a number of years ago.
Sure, there's, and this is what makes writing about this, not just this period, but writing about intelligence so exciting, because new stuff keeps being released, keeps being declassified. Over in Britain, MI5 and MI6, they have no statutory obligation to release anything. MI6 doesn't, but MI5 does. And the Foreign Office also will unexpectedly release dumps of material. And in this case, the sort of the gold mine for this book was this batch of material from the Foreign Office, which had a whole load of MI6 messages written by Stevenson, which was sent straight to MI6 and then forwarded on verbatim to the Foreign Office. So MI6 doesn't release stuff, but the Foreign Office does. So you get a large number of these documents, which otherwise would just sit in the MI6 archive. So there's that. But there's also the SOE documents. So a large amount of SOE material has come to light. And that story I was telling earlier about Roosevelt trying to get the press story about the Russians being weirdly tolerant towards organized religion, that came from SOE material, which was another, was a real boon finding all of that. So those were the two really useful sources.
I always think, thank God for the Foreign Office, because that is exactly the path to MI6 documents. The lady here on the aisle. Please, wait, ma'am, wait for the microphone.
How influential was Stevenson in the creation and the recruitment of, later on, Philby, Burgess, and McLean?
That's an easy one. He wasn't involved at all. He was because he was a head of station over in the US, and so all of that was going on back in London. I mean, I can't see how he would have done, and he was very much, he's taken on by MI6. He's only with MI6 for 5 years, and he's not in head office. He's not in London. He's not having an impact on the culture back at home. And I mean, also to a small extent, I think it's been sort of exaggerated sometimes. I don't want to say he kind of goes rogue or sort of cuts ties with London, but he has an increasingly distant relationship with London, with his boss. So no, he wouldn't have had an impact on that. Yeah, his boss, originally it was a guy called Sir Hugh Sinclair, Admiral Sir Hugh Sinclair. And then later, actually, no, sorry, I got it wrong. It's, yeah, he was codename C. That's the kind of easy answer. Originally it's Sinclair, but then it's Mingies, that's it, Stuart Mingies. And they change over in late 1939.
A major pronunciation challenge. The guy Mingies is actually spelled Menzies, but you'd have to be Scottish or at least British to know that.
Yeah.
One of these intriguing intelligence facts. Lady way at the back.
Should I repeat it? So I'm curious about the threat of anti-Semitism that might have influenced some of the policymakers, and it has been written that Roosevelt had some anti-Semitic mindset. So that's one part of the question. Then on the other side, what was driving the agenda of this century group, the powerful Eastern elite, who wanted to enter the war? Was it humanitarian, anti-genocide goals, or was it more of a quest for geopolitical power?
Good question. I can start with the latter one about the Century Group. It certainly wasn't for money, I know that. It certainly wasn't for political gain in terms of how much they all stood to lose if what they were doing came out in the early days. So they risked a certain amount by with their activities. Was it a quest for geopolitical power? I think it would have been clear to all of them that America coming into the war would be a good thing for the geopolitical power of the United States. But I think deep down, it's more to do with a version of what they wanted America to be, what they wanted America's role in the world to be. And it was a more internationalist outlook, which they shared. So that, I suppose, is the bedrock. But beyond that, it's about survival, it's about self-preservation. They were convinced that the longer you left taking on Hitler, the more powerful he would become. And as they repeatedly stressed to each other, but also in literature, the sooner you take on Hitler, the better. So that was part of it. In terms of anti-Semitism, I'll be honest, I haven't read anything about Roosevelt's anti-Semitism, if that is a thing. You may know more about this. I can talk a lot about Lindbergh's anti-Semitism. That's easier. I mean, the one thing to say about Lindbergh in this anti-Semitic meltdown he has on the 11th of September, 1941 in Des Moines. Is it called Des Moines? Des Moines, beg its pardon. Is the role played by the German embassy. Lindbergh was not in touch with the German embassy. However, the German embassy was in touch with people who are very close to Lindbergh. And there are some really interesting cables back and forth between the German embassy and Berlin. And in the summer of 41, you have this idea which comes to the fore, whereby the Germans want there to be essentially an American pogrom. They want to put out this idea that there is a Jewish faction trying to bring the country into the war. And there's even one message in which they say, but we just need a leader. We need one American to lead this pogrom. We need someone to go public with this idea. And this message we know is communicated to people who are close to Lindbergh, and we know that Lindbergh spoke to those people in the weeks just before he gives this speech. And in the speech he gives, he presents almost exactly the same idea. And there's almost something tragic in this, because Lindbergh is I don't want to call him naive, but he is very trusting. He's very trusting of people who share his political beliefs. And I don't think it would have occurred to him that the people he was talking to had been given this idea by the German embassy. Anyway, it seems pretty likely that idea did get to him that way. He presents it. He imagines the country will think, oh, that's a pretty sensible thing to say. And they don't. There is this justified, extraordinary reaction to it. And suddenly he becomes a pariah figure.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have time for a couple more quick ones, if there are more questions out there. Yes, sir.
Influence the United States, but the Germans must have been trying to do the same thing, and maybe even the Russians. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. There was an extensive German influence campaign, and when Stevenson arrives, it's doing a hell of a lot better than any British equivalent. And for the first 8-9 months of Stevenson's time in America, he's continually being told to hold back. And meanwhile, the German operation is thriving. It has the support of prominent figures in business. It also has the support of various congressmen who are working with the German embassy to get pro-German, or you could say Nazi propaganda, let's say pro-German pieces into the congressional record, where they could then be reprinted at US taxpayers' expense, but then also sent around the country at US taxpayers' expense using the congressional franc. And so there were a number of US congressmen who were willing to work with the Germans in that sense, which gives you just an idea of how far this German campaign got.
All right, one more. Yes, at the back, right at the back there.
Fascinating reporting that you've done.
Thank you.
How can one go about researching to ascertain the scope of fake news? Did ONA knowingly report fake news on the basis of receiving money, or did they think they were getting an exclusive? And what about the American media? How did ONA get away with it? Because usually they'd have to source, attribute the information, and the American media would want to match their reporting. So how come it wasn't found out that there was dubious reporting here from the rest of the American media? Did they turn a blind eye, or what was their
Yeah. Really, really good questions. The short answer to the first question is it was only the proprietor of the ONA who knew what was going on. So he would then pass on these stories, and I think actually he did describe them as exclusives. He'd pass them on to his staff, and his staff would unknowingly then broadcast them. And in terms of the kind of journalistic standards, how did all of these stories successfully make it into these papers? I suppose, in a way, you should give some credit to the kind of the news laundering, if you like, that these stories had been picked up in neutral capital cities in Europe, and they then, by bona fide journalists there, who believed them to be true because they came from the ONA or from the WRUL. So these are genuine journalists who heard it, and they reported it back. And I guess as a news editor, if you're getting something from a variety of sources, and it's slightly different each time, and all of those sources, as far as you're aware, are credible, you can be forgiven for running the story. And that's basically what happened a large amount of the time. But there's an earlier question as well. You're asking about where you can kind of find out more. There is an extraordinary document in the British National Archives, which shows every one of the SIBs. So SIB kind of 1 all the way through to about 387. And then it shows exactly which papers picked it up. And it's a remarkable thing. And so it's all being monitored. And you can see the extent of this. Was that? That is indeed, yeah.
Which gives you a pretty good idea, I think, of how much fun archival research can actually be. There are moments where you find something like that and you feel that your day has really been made. The witching hour is upon us. As always, with such rich and fascinating material, there's a lot more we could talk about than we have time to talk about, but we can pursue it upstairs where the book is available, and I'm sure Henry will be happy to sign books for anyone who's interested, so we can continue up there. In the meantime, thank you all for coming.